Okay, we have in the studio with us right now Mr. Fola Arthur-Worrey, former Director of Public Prosecution, Lagos State, former Solicitor General of Lagos State, former Executive Secretary of the Lagos State Trust Fund, and also at a point he was also Commissioner of Lands in Lagos State, to discuss the security situation in Nigeria, the justice system, and how the judiciary can be more justice-oriented, and a number of other issues. Welcome to the program, Mr. Arthur-Worrey. And good to see you. Quite an age. We haven't seen for quite some time. Now, you were the Executive Secretary of the Lagos State Security Trust Fund, which later became a model for other states, you know, and even the federal government tried to study that model. Now, we've been hearing a lot about dealing with the Boko Haram challenge and other insecurity issues in Nigeria. And, you know, security chiefs talk about change of strategy, what to do about the security architecture. What is it that the federal government is not doing that has, you know, made insecurity so intractable, such a difficult challenge in Nigeria? What are the options that you think are available?
I can only express an opinion and link it to, if we go back in time and then moving forward and watch. For me, fundamentally, I think the erosion of police power, authority, and capacity is a major contributor to the insecurity then. Because I think we have to split the concept. The first rule, the first principle of a modern state is the maintenance of law and order and the apprehension of criminals, which is essentially a police function. And that's why the police are the largest agency in Nigeria with over 300,000 personnel and are the most widespread. So in every ward, in every town, urban area, rural, you have police stations. So, but then Nigeria is a country, in my view, that is fond of experimentation. So when the complaints about diminishing police capacity were first made, probably around the 70s, instead of addressing that capacity, we began to multiply agencies. That's what we do. So moving from the police as the sole custodian of law and order, we began to create the Road Safety Corps, the Civil Defense, the EFCC, ICPC, NDLE. All these are traditionally police functions. So then you've suddenly got a whole gamut of new agencies with new administrative structures and so on, all being serviced by the limited funds available. And then this was an amputation of police power. So gradually you found that the police were not even certain of their mandate anymore. There's no country in the world that sets up a special agency to do with traffic. It's a police matter, you know? So that's one. The second, I think, is I would call it militarization, sort of changed the ethos of the police. They became more expeditionary and reactive rather than preventive. You understand? Then you look at a situation where we complain about insufficient numbers of the police. That's what we do. And then we say we are going to undertake a recruitment exercise, which has an impact on the fiscals, because you're going to pay salaries. Meanwhile, you have over 100,000 armed policemen on VIP escort duty, which is extraordinary. There is no, we saw the policeman standing next to an assault taking place right under his nose, and he did not intervene, which means he has ceased to be a police officer, or peace officer, as they used to call them, and is now a bystander whose loyalty, whose mental state is such that he doesn't even know his role beyond, oh, I have to protect my principle. So VIP protection, in my view, It's not a core police function. It is not. When you study policing policy, you find only two categories of people that are entitled to that form of protection. The first is one whose incapacitation will have a grave effect on the running of the state, such as a president, such as a governor, such as a chief judge, right? The second category is the individual or group that may have critical evidence that is desired or required in the resolution of a criminal case or a national security matter, and whose incapacitation will prejudice a successful management of that matter. It is not for the elite to use as a sort of, what's that word we use? It's now about ego. You have pastors with police. You have foreign contractors, etc. The principle is police the space, not the person. That's how, so for me, there are certain policy decisions that have to be made to restore authority to the police, because they are the first line of defense. Army only comes when everything has broken down. Then I think there's too much engagement of non-state actors in security, vigilantism, which we seem to encourage. Whereas the very word vigilantism means a group of people with non-judicial powers who take over security when there is total breakdown of law and order.
Well, you seem to be recommending reform.
A serious reform.
Yes, reform. But
yes.
What kind of reform in specific terms? Some people, for example, talk about state police. Some people talk about community policing. Some people say, well, you know, you have to decentralize the police. And you say certain policy decisions have to be taken.
made. So
what kind of policy decisions?
If you see, we've got to take it, I think, in steps. So there's no magic bullet, because the rot is deep. The underfunding is deep. The ethos has been eroded. So there's no, you can't say, oh yeah, let's just do state police and suddenly, magically, all the problems will go. First of all, it presumes that states are themselves capable of creating and establishing and running a professional police. You know, so, but for me, the first thing we have to do is re-resource the police. That's number one. They don't have the resources. No matter how many men you recruit, if they don't have patrol vehicles, communication, etc., they're not adding any value whatsoever, except number. So I think we need to look at that in the short term. We need to boost their capacity, right? And happily, the federal government has, the president has signed the police equipment trust fund bill. How they run it, that I'm not going to be able to anticipate that, but that's important. Secondly, we need to look at the budget. The police budget is not needs-based. It is merely a replication of how they prepare the budget each year. It is not a bottom-up system. What you're supposed to do with the police budget is that you're to take every police division, for instance, into account and look at the circumstances under which they operate. Some states are huge in area. Therefore, they would require a different budgetary allocation. Urban areas, different considerations. So that budget needs to be more detailed in terms of, as it is now, it's rather opaque. So you can't even oversight it properly. Because if a budget says 9 billion naira for vehicles without specifying what type of vehicle, where are they going, etc., then you're going to have a problem. So that's number two. Number three is that we need for me, we need to free up the resources that are involved now in non-police functions, as I've said. Every morning when I'm leaving my house in Lekki, I see police officers, right, walking about, sitting down, discussing, going to buy food. They are all officers attached to. Now, if your boss doesn't go out for the whole day, it means you sit idle for that is an extraordinary situation to be. I've never heard of it. that a police officer in a country that is facing terrorism, kidnapping, will sit idle under a policy that's not regulated, not written, not oversighted.
So before I ask you the next question, we just have to take a short break. Okay. Then we'll be back with this conversation.
All right. I need
Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. We're still speaking with Fola Arthur-Worrey, a former Chief Executive of the Lagos State Security Trust Fund, a former Solicitor General of Lagos State, and a former Commissioner of Lands, Lagos State. As you were saying, sir.
Yes. Now, you raised a critical issue of state police. Now, most federations run that model. So you have a federal police policing items or crimes arising from items on the exclusive list, like counterfeit currency, terrorism, cross-border crimes. So once a crime commences in one state and crosses to another, like a robbery in Ogun and a pursuit into Lagos, then it becomes a federal matter. So in America, for instance, cross-border kidnapping is an FBI matter. So I think what is key before we establish state police is the issues of jurisdiction. Otherwise, we're just going to have another level of conflict. So clearly, state police for me will, one, be better able to understand local problems. Will have better relationships in terms of community policing, and would be politically accountable. So, as it is today, a governor has limited control over the actions or inactions or incompetencies of a commissioner of police because he has no role in his deployment, right? A governor cannot even speak to DPOs directly. If he gets a complaint, for instance, that a particular DPO is not performing his duty, he has no powers. And therefore, police mostly operate without a level of political oversight, particularly when they are deployed to states. So it's at the whim of the IG whether he'll react to a complaint or not. But if you have state police, then the governor will bleed political capital if there is incompetence in the police. It will be a direct thing. And then he will have the power to say to the commissioner, sorry, you're not doing your job. So there will be proper control instead of this nominal chief security officer title, which is another of the myths that confuses us about where responsibility for policing lies. So my view is that a federal police, more compact, right, and more focused on defined areas will complement a state police, which will deal with, for instance, state offenses. But it's not going to be a silver bullet. You still have to have clarity of policy, you have to have proper funding, you have to have good leadership. And, for me, that's a way forward.
Well, you've made the benefits of state policing very clear, but not the issue of funding. Can you talk us through the model of the Lagos State Security Trust Fund?
Yes.
What necessitated it? How was it set up? How was it funded? And is that model, would you recommend that it's replicated across the country?
All right. You raise a critical point, and I did mention when I first talked of state police that capacity would be an issue, and there's no guarantee that states can, because in the current federal structure, in my view, although states do most of the work in terms of the day-to-day governance, because the people are there, they don't get the funding that, for instance, Lagos is a port city, right? And through this port city, every day are lifted 70% of Nigeria's fuel needs through one port. Therefore, the city is inundated with trailers, tractors, etc., tankers, but it doesn't get any benefit. There's no benefit. It carries the burden, but it doesn't get the benefit. So for me, first of all, the financial structure or the fiscal structure needs to change. So if there is state police, the allocations from the center going to the states must reflect the fact that the states are partly taking the burden of policing off the federal, right? So there must be an increased allocation. The second line of funding is the budget, right? But that's competitive. There's so many other issues that have to be dealt with. Health, roads, hospitals, etc. So certainly the budget may not be sufficient. And therefore you need a funding model that is ex-budget, that's outside the budget, but very accountable, which is what the trust fund was set up for. Because the federal government in the past 30 years has underfunded the police, and I mean severe underfunding, it had become, it had become almost an accepted thing that the police would immediately, if a commissioner of police is appointed, his first visit is a courtesy call on the governor, right? And they say, oh, welcome, I'm going to help you. Then he leans over, excuse me, sir, we don't have vehicles. We don't have this, we don't have that. I mean, at the time, we don't have accommodation. We don't have even, I'll get to it. So, I think Lagos State in 2007, under the Governor Fashola, felt that this was not a sustainable system. It was very ad hoc. You can't account for, if you give the police 10 vehicles, as is the usual thing, you call the press, everybody gathers, and then you hand over 10 pickup vans. You really don't know where they're going, how they'll be used, etc. There's no accountability. So the governor felt that that process should be institutionalized, that it was not likely that the funding will increase significantly from the federal government since they are tied to this, they are replicated budgets, like I said. So the governor engaged with the private sector first because, you have to advocate, you have to consult. And they were saying, yes, we need something because bank robberies, home invasions at that time, kidnapping had not reared its ugly head, but there was violent crime, carjacking, shootings, people were getting shot, etc. So he decided to first set up a committee headed by former IG Musiliu Smith, and with private sector, public sector people, and they came up with one answer: funding. It's the first principle. Ancient kings, when their armies were going to war, you always had to have something in your hand, even if it was a stone. If you went into battle barehanded, sorry, you were. So, the private sector began the contributions, and the governor quickly sent the bill to the State House of Assembly for consideration, and it was passed. And it was the first bill that the governor signed into law in his administration. Lagos State Security Trust Fund bill. So one of the things I want to underline here is the speed of the process, which is something we have problems with a lot of the time. We propose and discuss, but this was speed. Then inaugurated the board, including Ruben, and critically, and I want to say this, critically, we excluded members of the police and other security agencies from the board. People would think, oh, it's a security trust fund, you should have representatives of the agencies. After all, how will you know what they need? But people must understand the fundamental thing that you cannot be a trustee and a beneficiary.
Absolutely.
And you cannot, and if you bring in all those agencies, you are going to have conflicts.
You made a very good point when we started off this conversation. You spoke about the capacity of the police force, how we have about 300,000 officers. And you'll see a good 350,000, and you'll see about 100,000 attached to VIPs or armed attached to VIPs. Now, this brings up the issue of quality and quantity, right? And that debate that's always gone on, and increasing the quality of our police force. Now, this is what the fund aimed to do, and one of the main parts of the fund was improving the working conditions of our police officers through units, etc., things that were going to motivate our police officers to want to perform their services. But a point that's often not touched on is that of intel gathering and that of making sure you have an efficient rapid response service. Because without having that, which is proactivity, what you have is a very reactive police force that we're still seeing today. So how has the Lagos State Security Trust Fund worked on improving the proactiveness?
Now, like I said, first principle, people talk intelligence gathering like it's something easy. It isn't. And it's very expensive because you calculate it in man hours and you calculate it in, if I'm following a man who I suspect is planning a terrorist attack, I follow him from one end of Lagos to another, it's an expense. So you've got to take it, first of all, in the fundamentals first. So your first line of your first funding goes into existing structures to strengthen them. And you know, Lagos State had Rapid Response Squad.
Yes.
Right. So we looked at that because Rapid Response Squad, unlike the divisions, can operate across division lines. So it can respond to anything anywhere. So that was the main focus. And you found that, first of all, first key, improved visibility. That's your number one deterrence. Number two, improved patrol capacity. And number three, communication. Because if you don't have communication, there might be 10 policemen around the corner where something is taking place. Yes.
We'll need to take another short break.
No problem.
And then when we come back, we will continue.
All right.
Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Fola Arthur-Worrey, a former chief executive of the Lagos State Security Trust Fund, a former Solicitor General of Lagos, and of course a former Commissioner of Lands for Lagos, is still here with us on the morning show. Now, before we went on a break, I asked you a question about the intelligence gathering that you were responding to. So,
I say it's a key element, but you don't really see it. You don't. Every policeman is an intelligence gatherer in any location is. But the first thing you have to do is restore their physical capacity and their confidence. So you give them vehicles. Look, at the time the trust fund was set up, I think the RRS had about 16 vehicles. And there was no maintenance plan, there was no input, so you could get a distress call, and then you get the team together and you jump in the car and the battery is flat or the tire is down. So there are all these human elements we don't seem to look at. So what the trust fund did, first of all, like for instance, between 2007 and 2011, it was able to move 524 vehicles, 524 to the police and all. It has never happened before. The average number of vehicles sent to each command from the center every year is 3. That's how it is. 3 vehicles. Lagos had at that 107 divisions, and you are sending 3 vehicles. So that there was just a disconnect between need and. So the trust fund came in. So 524 vehicles is like, and total to date has been about 1,500. So it's been critical. The second issue is communication. So walkie-talkies, base radios. The police system doesn't really exist. You have policemen, but you don't have a system, and that's the reality. So the trust fund looks at, all right, you see men walking around with walkie-talkies, right? And you assume they're connected somewhere. But the repeater station is broken down, so it's just for image. So you've got to change the repeater station. So what the trust fund first did was deal with those fundamental equipment needs. Remember, doctrine, strategy, etc. is a police thing. The trust fund was not set up to say, we want you to do this or do that. Just first of all, restore some measure of capacity, restore public confidence, and then we can grow from there. That's how we grew into building the first command and control center in Nigeria, where you could call emergency call 767. It's the first that was done, except in the old days where if you phoned 999, I think went straight to the police station. So what trust funds do is fill equipment gaps and intervene in special cases. For instance, because the trust fund met from time to time, even though agency commanders were excluded because of that legal principle, the fund would meet with them. When terrorism first reared its head in 2012 in Lagos, remember there was a trial, closed-door trial where people were convicted. What happens is that the agency that is responsible for that intel may not have the capacity, right? Because like I said, everything is cost. So they could come to the trust fund and lay out their plan and cost it. Then the trust fund would intervene. If not for the trust fund, they'd have to go through the secretary's memo, approval, etc. So the fund was important in its speed of response and therefore able for the police, not just the police, the state security, the military, OP MESA, to build up. And I think that fundamentally, the length of time the fund has lasted, which is 12 years, indicates that trust was built. That's key. It was key. Two things: transparency, accountability. We never failed on that score. We were not perfect in terms of, we couldn't solve all the problems. The problems are 30 years deep. But as a sort of mechanism which can make fundamental change, we hired NGOs to do crime service independent of us, so we could see whether there was indeed an impact, and there was a measured impact in terms of reduction in crime and perception. It is perception. You go to America. America is one of the highest crime countries in the world. Gun crime, all kinds of people shooting. But when you go there, you don't get that sense if you are walking through New York. But it's happening. So it's important that it's a perception you get. And that's why an old friend of mine, the former DGSS, who's late now, says that the goal of a security infrastructure, maximally, especially in this kind of climate, is to establish a state where the people feel the relative absence of fear. That's the key. That when I'm walking down the street, I feel secure, and that if anything happens, there'll be a response. And you mentioned response, and I think we're able to improve police response by about 350% when you consider what it was before, where you phoned the station, no vehicle, etc., etc. There are still management failures within the police structure in terms of how they, one, deploy. There's a lot of diversion, so there are not enough policemen in the stations because, like I said, 100,000 of them are doing escort duty. So,
handbag carrying.
Well, just being there, when these 10,000 men they are going to employ, they will not be able to bear arms for the first 3 years in the force. Yet, armed men, armed by guns paid by the taxpayer and salaries paid by the taxpayer, are escorting kids to school. So the government has to confront that. Otherwise, no matter the funding effort, if you don't fill these policy failures, you're not going to get the results
Mr.
that you
Arthur-Worrey,
need.
you've said a lot about the relationship between governors and the police, and also about the Lagos State Trust Fund, which became a model. Now, it even served as a model for the setting up of the Ogun State, Ogun State Security Trust Fund, which was in the news recently. The one thing that came out of that altercation between former Governor Amosun and those who were accusing him of stockpiling arms and all that. Did we have an armory in the government house in Lagos State?
No.
And is it normal for a governor to keep an armory in government house?
I'm still in my head finding it difficult to accept that indeed a governor would buy that many AK-47s, whatever, and keep in the house. So I'm not. It's one of those anomalies. I don't think it's totally true. Somehow, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. How do you buy them? How? I know that to buy that amount of equipment, because when the trust fund and the government bought 1,000 AK-47s and 2 million rounds of ammunition, first of all, it's a huge consignment. But we needed to get the NSA's approval, because firearms are an exclusively federal thing. So I think the story needs to be interrogated a bit more. Maybe they were talking about...
I'm talking about armory. The government
keeping guns, yes, and armory. Yes, and I'm saying that the only way he could have procured this, except through the black market, is that you have to get the clearance of the NSA. That's how it works. Any offensive firearm, has to come in through the NSA. So I say that the story needs further interrogation. I'm not just going to accept it. But there was no armory. It is not the business of governments to keep armories. It is the business of the agencies that the law enables to do this. But we did help them build. Remember, we did help them build. And just to tell you how difficult it is to police Nigeria under current conditions, you'll recall that Bode Thomas Police Station, an important police station in maintaining the peace in Surulere, was a rented property.
That is true.
And the
Okay, I
landlord was
remember
about
that.
to kick out the police. You can imagine that's how bad it was. So we had to step in and buy the property for the landlord so that we could maintain the police in that place. So that's how people don't seem to see that how bad it really is. So without the interventions of trust fund, I think the police would virtually be on the verge of collapse.
So I want to take you back to my question about replication, because earlier on you outlined the tremendous burden that Lagos State is under. But it can be argued that Lagos also enjoys tremendous benefits from that burden, because look at the IGR of Lagos that dwarfs the whole country. So will the PPP, private-public partnership, that we saw in Lagos so successfully with the trust fund, can that be replicated in other states that are not as commercially viable?
I want to, first of all, let me address this thing about IGR. First of all, you must understand that the value of money has halved since 2015, halved, and the IGR has not doubled. So it's not as much dollar, you know that every component of development in Nigeria, including everything around this room, if I look around, is important. So you dollarize your money. There's nothing that is made here.
But it's all relative, sir.
No,
Lagos
but
is in a much
listen,
better position.
no, let's put it in context. Now, Lagos gets 30 billion, right? Fine. But it has a huge population. Therefore, first of all, it has the highest number of secondary and primary schools in Nigeria. It has the highest number of general hospitals in Nigeria. It has the highest number of roads. Lagos has 10,000 inner and outer roads. So I think we over-exaggerate this IGR. It's comparative, yes, but in terms of development, a city, New York's budget is $80 billion a year. 80 billion, that's New York City, not state, city. And their police budget is about, if I remember now when they added the anti-terrorist component, about 15 billion of that, dollars. Now, Lagos' budget at current exchange rate is about $2 billion. So I don't think the comparison is fair. There is no benefit to the immigration and so on. Look, let me tell you, if many of the functions that Lagos carries out were carried out by federal, for instance, you must know that that airport road that is being built, the airport road, is a federal road, but it's the state that has taken on the burden because federal shows no inclination to fix it. So many roads that Lagos State repaired that are federal roads. So you won't get the full benefit of the IGR because the functions are not clearly carried out by who they are supposed to. Let me tell you, the trust fund was not the biggest contributor to police. Lagos State government was still the largest contributor, except that they put their contributions through the trust fund for the purposes of accountability. So Lagos remained, out of the 22 billion in assets and money that we were able to generate, Lagos State contribution is 65 to 70%. It was the cash donations from the private sector that enabled the management of the system, maintenance, replacement of assets, etc. We paid insurance for the men. We did the reward system where we paid, we gave plaques and money to deserving officers. We paid hospital bills for gunshot policemen who've been shot by guns, and so on and so forth. So I think that no pressure was taken off Lagos by the creation of the fund. What it did do, though, was enhance the capacity of the state and the fund to intervene and improve policing.
But what about replication, very quickly before we go
Yeah,
on the
replication.
break?
How do you mean?
How feasible is it to replicate this model,
No.
especially with what you're saying?
In every state?
Yes.
No, it's not feasible because you're basically dealing with the same donors. So you'll get donor fatigue. And it's in Lagos, the advantage is that most of the boards of the companies that are donating are here.
Exactly.
But it's an adaptation thing. I have never advocated that every state should have a trust fund.
Well, Mr. Arthur-Worrey, we need to take another break.
Okay,
And
no
when we
problem.
return,
We'll come back to that.
we would like to talk to
Yes.
you about legal issues, matters of law and justice.
All right.
Yes, we'll
No
take
problem.
a short break now. When we return, we'll continue with Mr. Fola Arthur-Worrey, who is still with us in the studio. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Still with us in the studio is Fola Arthur-Worrey, former Solicitor General of Lagos State, former Commissioner of Lands in Lagos State, and former Chief Executive of the Lagos State Security Trust Fund. Now, Mr. Arthur-Worrey, before we went on break, I said, maybe you conclude your thoughts on, state police and all of that. But I'd like to ask you a question about something that is also very topical.
Yes.
And that is this whole argument in Nigeria at the moment about the establishment of Ruga settlements, or what you call Fulani or Katu colonies. Now, in the whole of that conversation, before the president suspended the initiative, was the Land Use Act.
Yes.
You had the governors quoting the Land Use Act, saying we have powers under Section 1.
Yes.
Now, Section 1 is one of those issues that people talk about when they say we should review Land Use Act 1978 because it alters individual proprietary rights to land. Now that it's in focus, do you think what has happened now with the federal government stepping down provides a justification for vesting, land in trust in state governors?
Well, look, the bottom line is that when you create states, as we did, and remember, our states were not created by referendum, but created by military fiat. That's why no additional state has been created since the politicians came, because it's a very contentious matter. But when you create states, you have to give them capacity, you have to give them authority. Now, when Nigeria was a colonial entity, it had two major land legislations with the government. So the government has always had a role. You had crown lands, which enabled the Queen and her officers to acquire land for so-called development purposes. And then you had the Public Lands Acquisition Act of 1976, which allowed the federal government to acquire land anywhere in Nigeria for developmental purposes. Then the same military, in their wisdom, decided on the Land Use Act, which vested the land in the governors. That's the only way by which if you are the governor of a defined area, right? And then federal just comes in and says, "Oh, I want this," then you have a problem, right? So the legal position remains the same. Remember that I think it was who was Jonathan, or was it? No, it was Yaradua. Remember that they set up a committee to review the Land Use Act, the Constitution, but it's going to be very difficult because if I'm a governor, I will lobby very hard that my assembly does not support such a reform. And what are we reforming? The problem with landhold is not the fact that the governor is trustee. Most people hold land for 90 years, 100 years. The problem is the administration of it. It's too slow, it's too cumbersome, and it's holding back the transfer of capital by way of sale of property. So, or mortgages, or consent. If we can improve that, there's nothing wrong with the system. Fundamentally, what it does is that it enables a measure of autonomy for each state under a federation. If we were a unitary system, yes, we'd understand. So, for now, the position is very clear, and it is unlikely to change, that governors hold land on behalf of the people in Nigeria.
So technically, there's no way the federal government can set up a Ruga settlement without the concurrence.
Once the Land Use Act repealed the Public Lands Acquisition, that ended the federal government's power to acquire land in any other part of Nigeria, except through a governor's consent. So they are limited to the FCT. They can do what they like there.
I have to take you back to my question, sir,
Right.
about replicating the Lagos Security Trust
Let me say that the creation of a trust fund to fund security is itself an anomaly. It's unusual, it's not normal, and it indicates fiscal problems with the national fiscus. It indicates the problem. Whether it is a problem of not enough funds per se, or funds going into places that are not priorities. For instance, If the government decided today that there will be no more foreign trips by any of its, I mean the federal government, because it's the largest government, by any of its officials, whether it's for seminar, whether, you know, we just like the travel thing. If you stop it, you'll suddenly find that you have $1 billion, which you can now put into the police budget. But it doesn't work like that. Every sector holds on to its, you know, its empire. So a trust, so like I said, a trust fund is not a usual approach. When I addressed the full plenary of the United Nations on crime and mega cities, I gave the Nigerian example, the Lagos example. And the first question was that, are you running your agencies on charity? Because that's basically what a donation is. Donations by states are also charitable. They are non-funded mandates. But there now is an expectation by any policeman who comes to a state that the governor, he'll even be telling you that, when I was in Rivers, they gave me this. I said, that's an unfunded mandate. It's just a convention, it's not. And that's why there's limited accountability about how these funds or equipment are used. So your question, if every state had a trust fund, there'd be varying measures of success. Some have been set up and have collapsed, like I said. I would hope that the passing of the signing of the bill on the Police Security Trust Fund, I would hope, would mean less pressure on states to fund the police. That should be the whole idea. It shouldn't be you set up a trust fund and yet states are still saying, hey, I'm still buying vehicles for my people. So the thing now is that I think that Nigerians must begin, like you are doing, to begin to ask the questions. We can't just say, oh, they've signed the bill, therefore everything. No, that's why I said that Twitter, I said it yesterday at the panel, at the lecture, that Twitter is another institution. So let's begin to engage. We don't engage enough, and so people get away with taking all kinds of decisions. Let's engage on this issue of VIP protection. Why should I be pushed off the road as a citizen by a private citizen who's putting flashing lights on his car? Nowhere in the world do I know it that private citizens are allowed to use emergency light. Nowhere in the world. And this is what I say about the erosion of police authority. Now we don't know who has the authority. If I can put blue lights, you can put blue lights. Who's in charge?
Hey, you can just go down to a mechanic now and get the cars on.
So, well, the argument a lot of state governors are making, not in the Southwest,
about
they can't afford
yeah, no problem. The state police issue would not be a compulsion. They won't say there must be state command. No, some governors say, I'm fine with the current arrangement. But where you have states that are heavily populated like Lagos. Look, Lagos is 20 million. I don't know about the census figures, but we live here. We know the level of congestion. And then you just deploy 25,000 police without, there's no analysis of need or whatever. These are the police. Then we train 5,000 of them in your intelligence. We did training for them, and then suddenly they'll be redeployed to Borno because they are not.
But another issue around that, not just the redeployment, but also the fact that when we speak about the state policing argument, one of the arguments that comes up is that certain states require certain agencies within the police force that other states may not. For example, there may be states that need a special anti-robbery squad and states that don't. And we know how many issues we've had around that, but I think the basis of that still comes down to education. There is a serious worry on behalf of the citizens when it comes to the education of people that are really and truly holding weapons in front of you. And one of the greatest depictions of that has been with the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. Take a Lagos State Trust Fund, for example. What has that done to actually improve the educational standards of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad? Because we know how much has happened around that.
I don't know what you mean by education.
The
What do
basic
you mean by,
education of our police officers.
No, are you talking about training?
Not just the training.
I can train, listen, in the American military, Marine Corps, it is the training that makes the Marine, right? So he can be educated, he can be a PhD, doesn't mean he'll be a competent Marine. Let's put it this way. Before you talk of the education, you've got to define the ethos and the mandate. The fact that a person is educated does not mean he'll be a competent policeman.
Absolutely.
Good. So what the trust fund did, like let's look at SARS. SARS was Lagos State's most potent weapon in breaking the kidnapping gangs. We used SARS. I don't believe in throwing the baby away with the bathwater. Remember, kidnapping in Lagos started in December 2011 and became really, Lekki was a target, VI, etc. Working with SARS, headed then by Kyari, who now heads the Inspector General's Intelligence Unit, Lagos State broke, and I say this with, with knowledge, 13 gangs that were based, some in Ghana, some were, would come in, snatch, and go.
This is SARS themselves.
SARS. They were extraordinary. They just wiped them. And then you found kidnapping went down, except in the far suburbs. So I don't subscribe to this hysteria. I say that one of the most potent weapons of the existence of SARS was deterrence, because the robbery community, if I may call them that, were in dread of SARS.
Mr. Arthur-Worrey,
yes.
We'll soon come to the end of this conversation. But, you were Director of Public Prosecution. You were later Solicitor General of Lagos State, and you wrote a number of books on criminal procedure and justice system.
Yes.
Now, what is your assessment of the state of the judiciary in Nigeria at the moment, and what do you think we can do to make the judiciary going forward more justice-oriented?
I think it is justice-oriented.
Well,
I don't think. I think in Africa we are we are most respected. We've maintained stare decisis. We've followed basic principles, except in exceptional cases. I think it's one institution that, considering all the changes that Nigeria has gone through, has done fairly well. I think, for me, there are two issues to look at. We have to distinguish between the administration of justice, which is the judge's output, and the administration of the courts, which is the management of the systems. For instance, if a court says, we're going to do IT, right? It's all nice. They make this wonderful policy statement, but running it is a different challenge. You have to make sure all the systems, consumables, components, and I don't think civil servants are trained that way. I think you need court managers. So that's one of the most...
Mr. Arthur-Worrey, we could have continued with this conversation for the next 1 hour. There's so much to talk about.
It's so much.
So we want to thank you very much for coming.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.